According to this computer. Hello. So today, what we're going to talk about is religion. We both have different religions. I'm Jewish, he's raised Christian. And we also probably have slightly different perspectives on religion. So what we're going to talk about today is, does religion exacerbate the conflict aspects of Israel-Palestine? We can start, Lee, with your take first.
Okay. Look, absolutely. I think it from both sides, there's certainly and it doesn't necessarily have to be with the whole of people involved in the conflict, but there's an element of Jewish society that believes the chosen people ethic and the recreating the biblical Israel, the greater Israel. There's a Christian element that believes that Israel has to be reformed again for Armageddon to exist. There's an element, oddly enough, of Muslim society that believes that as well. And then on the other side, there is both Palestinians that believe that Judaism is responsible for a large part of the conflict, and there is a lot of Jews that believe Islam is responsible for a large part of the conflict. So yeah, absolutely. I think that religion holds a lot of sway in the Israel-Palestine conflict.
So I would say there would probably be a conflict of some sort if religion were taken out of the picture, but it would quite likely look different. So for example, if we looked at Jews in Europe and in MENA, which were where most of the ones who came to Israel are from, and we look at the Arab population, the local Arab population, the Holocaust was not really religious. It was more about the persecution of an ethnicity. The Roma people belonged to, by and large, the same religions as the people surrounding them, but they were persecuted, just like Jews, by the Nazis, and in relatively similar proportions and severity. The Nazis did explicitly say that the Holocaust was racial, not religious. And Jews who had converted to other religions were also getting persecuted on racial grounds. Now, in the Islamic world, it was religion as well. It was religion. It was probably more purely religious than it was at that time in Europe, although it was religious at other times in Europe. But in the Islamic world, there was probably a smaller ethnic distinction, given that a lot of the Jews had converted to Christianity and Islam earlier on and intermarried with the local populations. And in fact, Jews do cluster with MENA and Southern European people genetically. So if you took out the Jewish religion, there were other proposed homelands for the ethnic Jews, and it's possible that there would not have been Israel-Palestine at all. There would have been the conflict between the ethnic Jews and the people somewhere else, because they could well have picked a different homeland. It's possible it was really the more religious Zionists that settled, well, that were the deciding factor for making this homeland Israel. Many of the early Zionists were favoring other homelands.
Why do you think that if religion wasn't in the picture, that potentially, say, Berlin could have been Israel?
Probably not Berlin, maybe something more like Uganda or Madagascar.
Why wouldn't you think that, say, the Allied forces, given they won the war and given the Holocaust was predominantly the instigation of Germans, that they wouldn't have made Germany suffer for the Holocaust and given up Dresden, say not Berlin, say Dresden, say Nuremberg, one of the large German cities or areas, regions, and said that that's the new Israel?
Because their philosophy, once they won the war, was to be relatively forgiving of Germany economically and all that stuff. Basically, their approach was rebuild West Germany, which is what the Democratic Allies had in their sphere of influence, rebuild West Germany in their image as a democratic country, and maybe not give the Germans the people that they hate. It was also kind of bilateral, because a lot of the Jews, they didn't want to be there. They wanted to get away from the people who had persecuted them.
Sure.
And so they would most likely have put the state in one of their colonies.
Okay, so you think the Germans were the Jews themselves would have protested?
I think that it was, well, if you look at the proposed discussions of where it would be, Germany was very high on the list because it was something that nobody seemed to want. Not the Germans, not the Allies, not the Jews.
Right, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. The going back to the religion, do you think that secular Jews believe the conflict is about religion?
I think secular Jews believe, most secular Jews think that it has religious overtones. And I think that it's correct. There was an analysis of Israel-Palestine, and it had that it was not a purely religious conflict. It also was part of making the case that religion does not really cause wars, which is kind of where I come from. I think it might redraw political lines of difference in slightly different ways, a lot of the time, not even all the time. But I think without religion, there would still be wars. If you look at chimps, they have wars. A lot of social animals have wars, and chimps don't seem to have religion. But
would you take away, without religion, would you take away a lot of the motivation for war?
There are plenty of other motivations. People are going to be telling a story about your own group and the other group. So religion is a place to hang some of those stories, but it's not really the reason that those stories are there. Religion only caught on so much because it appeals to some sort of an aspect of human nature, but those aspects are there. And so, yeah, what was the question again? Where were we going?
I was wondering what secular, whether secular Jews believe that there is a religious aspect to the conflict.
I think some do, some don't. They kind of realize that it's basically about two people with different cultural identities and different national identities that were thrown together in this country, and they don't have a life together, and they won't separate. So that's a really difficult situation if you won't separate and you won't come together.
And again, on an individual basis, there seems to be a path towards binationalism that might work, and I think it's being sabotaged to some extent within Israel by government policy. But you've got 2 million, say they're not all Muslims, but a majority would be Muslim Palestinians that are citizens of Israel. And you've got you had until recently, probably some people argue after the May conflict that a lot of that was diminished, but you've got a certain level of cohesion where you don't have Palestinian Israelis committing a lot of terror acts. You've got a lot of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, who hold them up as a beacon to liberalism in Israel, that they've integrated into society, that they hold positions of power. That to me suggests that there is a space there where binationalism will work. But a lot of the laws discriminate against them, make it difficult for that area to be explored or nourished.
Well, I wouldn't just put the blame on Israel for the lack of binational sensibilities. I would also put the blame on the Palestinian side for having things like certain types of anti-normalization. Now, normalization is something that the Palestinians, each person has a slightly different definition of it, but there are a number of definitions of normalization that are basically against starting grassroots efforts of binationalism. And
do you see some of that as being objection to the status quo, though, as opposed to we just don't like Jews?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of, when you have a movement like this, a lot of things get conflated. So in some cases, it's like, what are you doing with these horrible foreigners? As in, we don't like you, you're other. It could be, it's probably some of both.
Okay, I just see that if I'm living in a Palestinian village in the West Bank, and I'm feeling the oppression of the state of Israel. I'm feeling the taunt of settlers. I feel, and I'm raising a family, and I feel the subjugation of movement. I find it difficult to get work. I live in fear of my house getting demolished, of maybe the IDF breaking in at any time at midnight, taking one of my kids away because they threw a stone at a tank. These sort of fears are constant, and I'm hoping one day they will disappear. I'm hoping whatever that resolution looks like, I'm hoping one day I'll be able to live a normal lifestyle with my family, without fear of discrimination. And then my wife starts talking or joins the mothers club of one of the settlements. And they meet every Thursday afternoon.
Yeah.
And I feel as though, why are you accepting the subjugation we're living under as being normal? Because by associating with a settlements mothers club, that's the signal you're sending out.
Bless you. Well, if a group has hurt you, it takes an extra step at some level to accept members of it as your friend. So there was some of that in after the Holocaust, So like, for example, one of the things I grew up with was my family not buying products from Germany. Now, in the case of Israel, Israel and Germany do have one of the better relationships of any country with Israel. And there was also a lot of post-war German to Israeli exchange programs, and Germany basically apologized for the Holocaust. And Israel was also a country that at certain points in its history, it needed all the help it could get. So all these were factors that led to a much faster path to Israelis and Germans getting along than a lot of other things. Like, I mean, it's pretty nice actually how fast it went. And part of it was Germany really trying pretty hard and Israel needing it. So, Palestinians whose families were hurt by Israelis, it might take more time, but if the early people who do this are clearly at some sort of advantage and can pull up their people with them, then I think it will go faster.
You'd have a pretty good idea of how the Rabbinical Council fits into Israeli politics. Do you think one, that they should even be there, or do you think they have too much power, or do you think they are just a namesake council that has no power in Israel?
I do think that the official rabbinate has too much power in Israeli politics, and it is coming at the expense of, among other things, other denominations of Judaism. So I do think.
So would that then suggest that the motion is it's true that religion is an anathema to peace?
I don't think so. Religion, you could have any kind of a group that just has too much power in government. By this logic, because of the military-industrial complex and the overwhelming influence of the business lobby in the United States, you could say that business is an anathema to peace. Is business an anathema to peace? Well, it is if you have military suppliers being lobbyists in your government and actually being able to swing the government to start and keep a certain war. But it's not an anathema to peace if you're talking about, say, promotion of small businesses to stimulate the economy and to build economic cooperation among different groups in the economy.
Although business is inseparable from politics, but I don't know that religion is the same. So you could have say a Catholic lobby group or a Christian lobby group, but if they weren't there, the country would continue the same way. If you took business out of politics altogether, you'd have a government. You wouldn't have anything to govern, really. It would. It's almost inseparable. I'm looking at this as a process. So, could the Rabbinical Council affect legislation, and could that legislation be in favor of Jewish Israelis over Palestinian Israelis?
I think that that's entirely possible. I also think it's not just the Rabbinical Council that is doing this. I think that there is also the mindset among some secular Jews that this country is ours, it's not theirs. And that's not exactly religious per se.
No, but it would have been fed originally by a religious, the religious notion of the chosen people, the land of Israel, the biblical narratives that.
Not really. There are plenty of people who share a country with other people who are not Jewish, who are thinking this land is ours, it's not theirs. That's not unique in history. Now,
No, it's not. Yeah, I agree.
It's not unique in history. What is a little bit different about Israel from some of these other countries is, not all of these other countries, but there are definitely parallels in a lot of them, is the sense of the feeling of vulnerability as a people, the collective PTSD from persecution, and therefore, well, the collective PTSD from persecution, and therefore the need to make sure, the need to be more possessive.
One of the things that I hear all the time on Quora, or read all the time, is the term Islam and Muslim when discourse on the conflict is being discussed. The idea that the Palestinians are predominantly Muslims and the Muslims are Arabs, and I also hear say comments like Bennett, who is the Prime Minister of the country, made at the UN that God gave the Jews Israel. So it's almost like there is two distinct religious narratives that underpin a lot of the conflict in the background. They may not necessarily all be adopted by everybody that's involved in the conflict, but it's certainly an underpinning that's not. So for example, secular Jews would not necessarily argue with Orthodox Jews if their notion was that God promised the Jews the land. Palestinians may argue the point, secular Westerners may argue the point, but secular Jews wouldn't pull them up and say, hang on, you can't say that, that's not true.
Well, secular Jews do not believe, of course, that God promised the land.
No,
the formulation is more like, this is our ancient historical land. We were in exile for thousands of years, and we still maintain the tie to the land. And this is why we are coming back to it. That's basically a secular formulation.
Sure. There's an element of Islam as well that believes that the Middle East. I don't know if that's true, but certainly that Jerusalem is important to Islam. One of the holy places for Islam. There's also the opposing side of that constantly both Muslims and Jews will use the other's religious narratives in a provocative way to suggest that they're not necessarily, or their claims are religious based. So you make Palestinians saying Jews believe they're the chosen people, or you might get a lot of Jews saying Muslims are told in the Quran to kill all the Jews. So there's that reverse.
Yeah. So Palestinians as well, they definitely have religious overtones in terms of their formulation of the conflict. So Islam and Christianity are largely supersessionist religions. So there is the theological perspective that Judaism is outmoded. And even if it's not an explicit belief of some people, it could be an implicit belief of some people. So the idea of these people with the outmoded religion are over us, that's anti-Semitic, because supersessionism is anti-Semitic. And it also implies that that people of a certain religion should be in power. Now, another thing as well is that Islam does tie the Arab world together. And yes, one could say that the loyalty is not perfect, but it is still quite strong. And this is why so many countries that have historically had little to do with Israel took a very long time to recognize Israel, and some of them still don't recognize Israel because even if they might be physically far away from the Palestinians, they still feel a tie to the Palestinians because of Islam. Now, that's one example where religion does exacerbate the conflict and in a sense makes it spread beyond just the local area and into other parts of the region as well.
Do you think that the people that drive the conflict, the politicians, believe the religious rhetoric that they maybe espouse?
I think some of them do, some of them don't. A lot of people also, they'll sort of pick up what's around them and compartmentalize. So at some level, they do believe it, but also because they're sort of believing it out of convenience and opportunity to, not just out of dogma. But of course, it would depend on the people.
Christopher Hitchens famously said before he passed away that the only thing you need for evil to triumph is good men to do nothing. And he suggested that you can't, to get a good man to strap a bomb on his back and jump on a plane and blow it up, for that you need religion.
They can't do that with everybody. They have to look around for targets. It's like any other abuser that is grooming their victims. And so, for example, they'll pick people who are more socially isolated and they'll groom them. They'll pick people for a lot of things. And then they have the whole protocol of conditioning them bit by bit to be the person who straps the bomb. And even then, it doesn't always work. Some people still just can't bring themselves to do it, even after they've been through all that conditioning, but enough people can. It's a pretty drastic thing to do. Suicide attacks are not unique. Japanese pilots did this during World War II. What the suicide bombers are doing is not so fundamentally different from that.
And a lot of them, look, a lot of it is not even necessarily the same. So I don't know this for sure. I suspect it's not necessarily even the same ethic. The a lone wolf knifer can just as easily be it could be the same driving mentality that brings a 14-year-old in the US to take a gun to school, knowing that they're going to be shot and shoot up school friends. This is that teenage angst that manifests in sort of certain violent behaviours in boys, a very small percentage of boys, but and brought on by frustration, mental illness, the hormones surging through puberty, a whole lot of factors. I think the conflict and the loss of dignity is one of the factors for a lot of Palestinian suicide attacks. And when you call them suicide attacks, it's not that they necessarily are killing themselves, but they know that if they attack a Israeli soldier with a knife, they're going to get shot, but will do it anyway.
Yeah. Well, there are also a lot of studies.
Which is very, very different to say a conspiracy style, a 9/11 type bombing. I think the motivations for something like a 9/11 and the operation and the preparation needed and is very different to the lone wolf knifer attacker.
Yeah. Well, some people here are loners, or they did it in small groups, or they got incited by not very professional groups of people. But the truth is, there is a very serious, very professional, there is a very serious, very professional network of people who are training these people to be suicide bombers. And there are people who have described this process because they have taken part in it. And so it is a little bit.
So I'm talking about, say, the HBO, the pizzeria bombing in the big one during the Second Intifada would be very different to, say, the kid that tried to knife a soldier at a checkpoint. One would have been a pre-organized campaign. One would have been a kid just waking up frustrated one day, and instead of committing suicide, decided that he'd take a soldier out with him along the way.
I agree that it's different, but both of them may be viewed in the context of a background of incitement and a background of anger, but one with a real professional network is just
making a political statement.
What?
Making a political statement.
Who making a political statement? The kid?
No, the professional, the professional, the guy with the pizzeria explosion is as horrific as it was a political statement as well. It'd be like the IRA bombings during the 80s and 90s, as compared to, again, just the individual kid with a knife trying to stab a soldier.
Well, the individual kid feels more like a lot of U.S. crime.
Yeah.
A lot of U.S. crime in the sense that there are a lot of frustrated people, and if you combine frustrated people with weapons, maybe with a little bit of validation on the internet, it's a toxic cocktail.
Yes.
If you once you get into professionals who are intending to target civilians, this is terrorism. Terrorism is attacks on a civilian population intended to induce fear for political motives.
Do you think that's interesting, and it's moving away a little bit from the religious discussion, but sometimes you hear, say, with Breaking the Silence, some of the soldiers say, we were told to go into a village and make our presence felt. And making our presence felt means that, we break into a house and move the occupants into a specific area and then stand on the roof and maybe fire into the air a few times, or shoot some gas canisters at group of kids, or so this is making. Do you think that is intended to make the population feel a sense of terror? And do you think that could be construed as terrorism?
What incident again?
Well, you made the comment earlier that terrorism is creating a situation where the public are in a constant state of fear.
Intent to create a situation where the public are
intent
by targeting civilians.
Okay, so do you think a state could do it? So do you think Israel could do it with the IDF?
Terrorism is usually done by an extra state actor.
Okay, so you think if there is a state involved, it can't be terrorism?
I think that if there's a state involved, it's state-sanctioned violence, but terrorism is usually done by an extra state actor.
So if a state can create a sense of fear amongst a civilian population, would you regard that as terrorism?
If a state were doing random violence against civilians to unprovoked to create a sense of fear, I would call that as attacks on civilians. I would call it as probably warfare against a population.
So you wouldn't call it terrorism?
I would probably put it more under either warfare or subjugation. If terrorism that some of the things Saddam Hussein did when to keep his people under subjugation. You wouldn't call it what? He was a recognized government.
Yeah, now, you wouldn't call it terrorism.
Probably not. I would say terrorism is also, people like to call things terrorism, but it is not the only crime, and it's not even necessarily the worst crime. Terrorism typically operates at a small scale relative to the population, for example. So terrorism basically probably won't fall under the category of genocide, which is worse, because genocide targets the entire population and terrorism only targets a random sampling of the population.
Yeah, I hear that. So I was in Washington when the Washington sniper was running around, and would you call that terrorism?
Only if it's instilling fear among a population with a political agenda in mind. If they don't have a political agenda, it's just a serial killing.
I don't know whether he claimed he had a political agenda. I don't know whether you could even call his agenda political, but so the motive is the differentiating factor for you.
For me, it's a combination of the agent, who is doing it, the tactics, what they're doing, and the motive why they're doing it.
So you couldn't simply say that if an action that keeps a population in object terror is terrorism, that wouldn't be a sufficient enough definition.
Okay, so if you have an animal who's a predator and they are periodically killing and eating people, and there's nothing that can be or is being done about them. And people are living in fear of this animal. Is that terrorism?
Well, they could say, we're being terrorized by this bear that's running around in the woods. Or we're terrified of the bear. The bear hasn't got agency, though.
Okay, so I believe that animals do have agency. If their motive is to eat people, then they have agency.
They don't necessarily understand that they're putting people in a situation of terror, though.
I think it's more like they don't care.
Yeah, they don't care.
They don't care that they're prioritizing their own needs, which is food. By the way, there are highly armed pack hunting animals that are highly social, that have a very high reluctance to kill their own. And
Okay.
so,
so what are they? That's interesting. What are those animals?
wolves are an example.
Okay.
Wolves, they live in packs.
They do attack other wolves in the pack, but that's just more for a power play to be the pack leader, I imagine.
It happens, but usually they hold back to some extent, and they don't really go to kill. There's a whole gradation if you're an animal with those kinds of weapons and a society that they could go for, and very rarely are they going to go out to the max and try to kill the way they would go for a prey.
Right.
Most pack hunting animals are like that. That's how they have a pack. And so
Yes.
they do have the sense of avoiding harming. Another one, and there are reported instances of them applying this to prey. There are instances of predators sparing individual prey, holding back and not killing them.
Okay, that wouldn't be wolves, though, would it?
I believe it has happened with wolves. There are instances where a lioness adopted the calf of an animal she killed, and it didn't work out very well because lionesses don't really have what it takes to take care of them. But it was done, and the lioness held back from killing the prey and adopted the prey instead. Hyenas have taken members of other species into their clans. There are instances of hyenas taking humans and wild dogs into their clan. And they also have a very elaborate ritual where, elaborate breeding ritual, where they really could hurt one another. And the point is that they don't.
So your view, back to this religious argument, your view is that even without religion, the conflicts would continue. Do you think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be as equally as violent and as long-standing and as polar without religion as what it is with religion?
So I would say it depends at what point you take out religion. If religion didn't exist at all, these peoples, as we know them, would look very different, possibly less well organized. There is very strong evidence from animal behavior that conflicts happen without religion, and they're probably not rarer.
Yep. So this is, would it be fair to say this is a tribal conflict and the tribe is centered around religious belief?
I would describe Israelis and Palestinians, more Israel-Palestine, predominantly as an ethno-national conflict. and religion plays a role, but it's largely nationality. That nationality and history that are driving the conflict.
And this is where some of my cognitive dissonance kicks in. So I can never be naturalized as a Jew, but I can convert to Judaism and then be recognized as a Jew.
Yes, basically, if you're, but that's how US citizenship works as well. US citizenship, if you're a natural born US citizen, then you automatically become a US citizen. So I became a US citizen because I was born in the United States to US citizen parents. Now, if you wanted to be a US citizen, you would have to convert to being a US citizen. You would have to move to the United States. You would have to do a lot of civic things. You would have to take a test.
I don't need to change my belief systems though.
If you wanted to be a Canadian citizen, you would have to swear allegiance to the Queen.
Yeah, okay, but I still don't need to change my religious beliefs.
Oh, okay, so actually, if you're an agnostic, by the way,
yes,
and you convert to Reconstructionism, you would not need to change your religious beliefs. Reconstructionism is not officially theistic, so Reconstructionism would accept an atheist who wanted to participate in Jewish culture.
and is Reconstructionists considered eligible for Aliyah?
Officially, it is Orthodox Conservative Reform, I believe. Reconstructionists are, I think the issue there is more that it's small. It's a small movement than that it's outside of the scope. Reconstructionism, it's kind of, in terms of how far out of the fold it is, it's probably on a similar level to reform. Reconstructionists are an interesting bunch in my experience because they're people who tend to be more committed and interested in the history, culture, and heritage than other groups of liberal Jews, because it takes a certain level of thinking about which Jewish community you would join to pick one that's Reconstructionist. But it is considered one of the major denominations. Well, it's sort of the small major denomination, but it kind of has an outsized influence relative to its numbers on other movements of Judaism.
Okay, and it's recognized as a branch of Judaism that allows you to do Aliyah and to become a citizen of Israel.
Okay, so my understanding of Aliyah is that it applies to Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. So whether Reconstructionism would fall under Reform. Okay, so I don't know offhand if Reconstructionism has been included, but it does seem to be the spirit of this rule, if not the letter, given that Reform is included.
Okay. Can I ask you then what your view would be if all the Palestinians were not Muslims, if they were agnostic or atheist? Do you think the conflict would be more severe, less severe, or the same?
Okay, so what might the ramifications be if they were not Muslims, if they were agnostic or atheist? My guess would be that they would be more closely aligned with the West, less closely aligned with the Islamic world. That is what seems to be happening with many Palestinians who are agnostic or atheist, that they are more closely aligned with the West, less closely aligned with the Islamic world. So how would that play out? I think it would be different in character, but it wouldn't be, it would be different in character, and it would be very hard to tell whether it would be better or worse. It also depends how you measure better and worse. What metrics are you going to use?
So do you think it would have extended for 80 years? Do you think that they would be in the same position they're in now? Do you think we would be closer to peace, or peace would have been achieved a while ago?
I think that, okay, so if you're going to change things on the Palestinian side, this is something Einat Wilf proposed in one of her books. So so her thesis is Palestinians' attachment to their former homes is the obstacle to peace. And so yes, and I don't think this is illegitimate. I think you can be like, change one thing. Is this going to lead to peace? Now, this is a very core part of Palestinian culture. If they were agnostics or atheists with a more Western type transactional view of land, I think, yes, this could have made the conflict simpler.
What about if all Jews were secular? What about if most Jews identified as agnostic or atheist? Do you think that would have made a difference to the conflict?
So if most Jews identified as agnostic or atheist, I've told you what I think. I think that assuming that we had the Holocaust, which is fairly reasonable, I think there would have been a good chance that the land would be located in a different place.
Okay. Yes, you did say that. So we've covered most of it, haven't we?
Yeah, we've covered most of it. So maybe we could wrap up with a statement. Does religion exacerbate Israel-Palestine?
My view hasn't changed much. I think that there is an element, and an element that is probably the extreme element. It's probably a small element of both that takes religion to the extremes and uses it as both provocation and motivation to keep the conflict going, and also to sabotage efforts of peace. So, I forgot his name, the person that assassinated Rabin, the guy that walked into the mosque in Hebron and shot up 24 people, the Palestinians that blew up the Sbarro pizzeria, the Palestinians that, the Munich hijacking, the murder of the the Israeli Olympians. These sort of extremists have got a religious underpinning. They're not probably the largest portion of the societies, but they do tend to make a huge difference, in my view, to the conflict.
That's a very interesting argument that religion, that a few people can spoil the barrel for the rest of us, and those few people are more likely to be religious. Not to discount religion, but there are plenty of people who use things like ethnicity as their justification for similar types of radicalism. And so I would say religion.
Racism, though, is far more or far less socially acceptable than religious bigotry. Religious bigotry seems to be more acceptable with societies. There's almost that you don't say anything bad about religion because it's sacrosanct, whereas racism is you can't say whatever you want about another ethnicity in fear of it being racism.
Well, only in religious circles might religious bigotry be more accepted. but in other circles, religious bigotry is considered on the order of racism here in the US, like saying you can't join this because you're not a Christian. Well, maybe a church, okay, but a job, that has the same legal ramifications as if you did this because of your race.
Well, yeah, I know within the law, but Donald Trump can turn around and say we're not letting any Muslims in for the next 2 years to try and keep the country safe, and not get much blowback.
What he actually did was he listed countries, specific countries that he closed doors
I'm
to,
aware.
and it was described as a Muslim ban by others.
Yes, okay.
When in reality, it was a ban on certain nationalities.
Yeah, but those nationalities were predominantly Muslim countries, or not even predominantly, they were exclusively Muslim countries.
Yeah, they were Muslim countries, but my point being, even Donald Trump has lines of explicitness that he would never cross. And he's considered someone who is crossing a lot of lines. Yeah,
no, fair enough.
But
sorry, and your view?
Okay, so I would say my view is that I don't think religion increases conflict overall worldwide, but I do think that because it's such an important part of people's identity, it has an impact on redrawing the lines of where the conflict is. So if religion were completely taken out of the picture, I don't think there would be less conflict overall, but this situation would certainly look quite different. So possibly better, although it's not inconceivable, but it would be worse. And there is a lot worse than the status quo. If it's actual open violence, for example, that's a lot worse. And so I would say religion is probably exacerbating this particular thing, but that does not mean religion is the cause of conflict. No,
I 100% agree with that. I probably have the same view. I think it's exacerbating the conflict. Certainly not the cause of the conflict.
It's not the cause. It's not the cause. The cause is basically culture and history.
Okay.
Yeah. So good discussion.
Yeah, lovely to talk to you again.
Yeah.
And we're off.
Yeah. So